right. Happy afternoon. Welcome to the fourth in our series on our colloquium series on global inequality and human rights. We're very happy today to have Vasuki Nesiah with us, who I'll tell you about, as well as Monica Jimenez to respond to the talk. For those of you who've been here before, especially the students in the seminar, you know that this semester we've been looking at three different frameworks, focused on three different frameworks: racial capitalism, world systems theory, and distributional analysis. And I just say, as a way to set it up, and we can talk about it afterward, that Vasuki Nesiah's work very much fits into the world systems theory and distributional analysis, and I bet if we ask her, she'll talk to us about the connection with racial capitalism as well. Vasuki Nesiah is a professor of practice at the Gallatin School of Individual Study at NYU. She's a frequent visitor to Texas law, and some of you may recognize her from her participation in a plenary panel at the Prison Abolition Conference we had at the end of September. She has a wide range of topics and very thoughtful things to say about them, so we try to get her here as often as we can. And we took advantage of her having a wedding here this weekend, actually, to have her speak today, which means that she got to see some nice weather before whatever is blown in now. And I thank you all for being willing to weather the storm today. Vasuki is a founding member of Third World Approaches to International Law, and if you don't know what that means, you should ask her. And you can just say, what about TWAIL? And she's published widely on the history and politics of, among other things, human rights, humanitarianism, international criminal law, international feminisms, and colonial legal history, with a particular focus on transitional justice and reparations. Her recent publications include an edited collection called A Global History of Bandung and Critical Traditions in International Law, which I highly recommend. And even though, edited book collections take a lot of work and thought, and it's very much, we could say, a creature of TWAIL and TWAIL thinking. And she also has a number of articles and book chapters on what she has called international conflict feminism, including the chapter she'll be discussing today, which was recently published in a book on governance feminism that will be launched later this week at NYU. The chapter is entitled Indebted, and I'm reading the title of the chapter first because it's a great title. Indebted, the Cruel Optimism of Leaning into Empowerment. And the title of her talk is related to that and is called Economic Empowerment in the Global Periphery, Leaning into Credit, Property, and Entrepreneurship. And I'll just say that our class had a great discussion last week about the paper and in context with some other materials as well. So after Vasuki speaks, Monica Jimenez will respond. Monica is an assistant professor of African and African diaspora studies at UT. She is a graduate of our law school and also has a PhD in history from UT. So she's a legal historian. She's working on a book titled American State of Exception, Race and Law in the Making of Puerto Rico, and much of her work is on the legal and political history of Puerto Rico. And she put together a fabulous conference last year that some of you may have attended on Puerto Rico, which was the Rapoport Center's annual conference as well. So part of working on the legal and political history of Puerto Rico means working on sovereign debt and on what's called promesa. So I think she's the perfect person to respond to the talk. And it's great because they also, Monica and Vasuki, have had a chance to engage with each other a little bit. So we're glad to be able to be witness to further engagement. So please join me in welcoming Vasuki Nesiah.
Thank you, Karen. So everyone I knew who used to be engaged this weekend got married. So I don't know, Monica, future engagements. So thank you very much to Karen and Eddie for inviting me and including me in your seminar, and the fabulous students who had a chance to I had a chance to engage with earlier today, and particularly Sidonia and Kelly, whose responses Karen had forwarded, which were great and actually made me sound much better than I actually do. So you should actually have them read this paper, and of course thanks to Sarah for putting everything together and making it possible to visit. Okay, so this paper seeks to do many things explicitly, and that it flags, and I'll speak to those things. But I just want to perhaps briefly talk about some of the things it doesn't explicitly discuss that it's doing. I would also like it. I had also thought of it as actually doing or as incorporated into my methodology. So this is a story about microcredit, debt, and women's empowerment in post-conflict Sri Lanka. But I want to do several things that are around how I approach that topic. First, I want to make the link between this story as a story of economic policy and a story about affective economies. I want to try and trace the way in which particular policies may feel like a lifeline, the conditions of desperation and despair that may move one to feel optimistic about loans, or the ways in which some policies may instantiate particular political subjectivities in ways that make it easier to imagine that debt may be what empowerment feels like. Secondly, I want to make a link sort of between the micro and the macro, to call forth sort of multiple scales of analysis that link the experience of particular families in northern Sri Lanka trying to build a house after the war to a story about how international conflict feminism reflects and refracts a sort of global economic order that emerges from the ground seeded by racial capitalism in sort of different historical layers. And thirdly, I want to employ what some may term a distributional analysis to unpack and assess policies packaged as progress. Women's empowerment and its sort of policy cognates in the development field, namely property ownership for women, women's access to credit, entrepreneurship programs for women, and so on. Here the intuition is that to be alert to unexpected consequences of the normative policy common sense, in particular to be alert to how the rationality of economic decisions may already be embedded in the logic of larger structures that frame my analysis. One needs to be attentive to these kinds of distributional consequences. Okay. So let me sort of move to the talk itself. And I can come back to any of those sort of background methodological assumptions or goals or practices in the Q&A. So Lauren Ballant argues that one dimension of the cruelty of life under late capitalism is that we get attached to a cluster of promises regarding the good life that are generated by and embedded in conditions that are already not working. Thus, we get attached to the very conditions that defeat the fulfillment of those promises. The difficulty of detaching from these compromised conditions of possibility trap us in a state of prolonged crisis, an impasse that naturalizes crisis into our ordinary. Ballant calls this emotion cruel optimism and notes that it introduces into our intimate and public lives a state of crisis ordinariness. This seems a particularly acute characterization of the structural function of financial debt for the economically vulnerable. Access to credit seduces with cruel optimism. It is intertwined with a cluster of promises regarding the good life, while this attachment to living on credit is embedded in conditions of economic dystopia that are precarious and unsustainable. The affective structure of empowerment in enabling and even easing access to credit precisely for those who are most financially vulnerable invites cruel optimism. Within feminist development economics, empowerment is an agential, participatory vision that shapes development policy, at once legitimizing that policy and producing crisis ordinariness in its subjects. This paper probes the work done by the promise of women's empowerment in post-conflict environments. It focuses particularly on the empowerment programs of international financial institutions and development agencies in the arena of market-oriented post-conflict economic development. I'm interested in how particular feminist ideas about the empowerment of women become part of the knowledge apparatus of institutions shaping economic governance in post-conflict environments, and concomitantly how these ideas traveled into policies and processes that had far-reaching effects on the ground, although not necessarily effects that were intended or anticipated. So my talk has three parts. The first part of my talk focuses on the path of feminist interventions into post-conflict development policy and the steering of that trajectory towards the promise of empowerment. Here I anchor in two arenas of feminist intervention: policies focused on women in development, and policies focused on women in post-conflict economic recovery. In the second part of my talk, I look at the intersections and convergences that bring together feminist development policy and what I call international conflict feminism, or ICF, in a post-war housing program in Sri Lanka called Owner-Driven Housing Assistance, ODHA. Like the overlapping zone in a Venn diagram, knowledge regimes of women's economic empowerment intersected with knowledge regimes about women in conflict and post-conflict environments and helped shape and articulate interventions such as ODHA. Finally, the concluding section locates a Sri Lankan case in relation to how it gets articulated in this zone of intersection and through the architecture of debt. In looking at the unprecedented debt burden that has emerged with these policies and the distributive and other implications of debt in the context of ODHA, of post-conflict Sri Lanka, and of global economic governance, we have a window into the cruel optimism of disappearing futures. Can you give me a timing thing when I'm, like, say, near the half an hour mark? Yeah. Okay, so part one, women's economic empowerment. Women's empowerment is cited as a goal across the field of international development, post-conflict reconstruction, and human rights. Development policy engagement moved gradually from an ostensibly gender-blind approach to one that framed gender relations and women as explicit targets of development policy, with special focus, as evidenced by the UN's 2015 Sustainable Development Goals, amongst other indicators, with special focus on women's empowerment as a central agenda. In the aftermath of World War II, the Bretton Woods institutions and other elements of the institutional framework for the post-war world economic order was set in place with development equated with economic growth and modernization. Early feminist criticisms of this model raised questions about the relationship between production and reproduction and flagged indicators of structural gendered vulnerability, such as rates of maternal mortality. The World Conference on Women in Mexico was a lens into how, by 1975, even this conversation had shifted, with a focus not only on gendered vulnerability, but also on gendered agency, and particularly on women as economic actors. Most important for us, here we see a feminist engagement with development turn on a more fulsome prioritization of empowerment. And the arc of that movement, say from the 1975 Mexico conference to the 1995 Beijing conference, tells a story that is significant to the one I'm discussing today. For those of you who are not in the sort of UN world, every 10 years, I mean, they haven't had it in the last decade, but with 1975, the World Conference on Women, the idea was that every 10 years there would be a World Conference on women. So significantly, debates at the Mexico World Conference laid bare the fact that there was no singular feminist approach to development. Rather, feminists had critical ideological differences, and the approaches they brought to the development field reflected those differences. In particular, this conference rendered audible an important articulation of differences between feminists from the global north and anti-imperial feminists from the global south. A divide reflecting a global class structure, global racial divides, and the differential weight of the histories of slavery and colonialism on different women. Gradually, partly as a result of this critique, the notion of empowerment began to enjoy uptake in feminist development circles as a way to prioritize and radicalize the development field to foreground questions of consciousness raising and economic redistribution. By the 1990s, the language of empowerment had become ubiquitous. For instance, the 1980 Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW as it's known, has no mention of empowerment. But by 1995, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action mentions empowerment over 30 times. The feminist embrace of the notion of empowerment reflected an effort to foreground women as the agents of change, not as targets of policy, and was embedded in this way in a larger effort to democratize development and link grassroots participation to socio-economic transformation. Today, the vocabulary of empowerment has been mainstreamed into the international development field, not just by grassroots activist development think tanks like DAWN, the Indian grassroots think tank, but also by international financial institutions and donor agencies. Women's empowerment is partly an empty buzzword, but it is partly a way to gesture to policies favoring a participatory approach to development. In a way, the empty buzzword aspect of empowerment is the most significant dimension, because it has allowed different strands of feminism to project their own diverse, even contradictory development ideologies into the language of empowerment. For instance, for Geeta Sen, an Indian development economist, the language of empowerment was a way to flag what she referred to as the multidimensionality of property. and to speak of the socioeconomic in ways that highlighted the politics of economics. However, as the language of empowerment traveled and got uptake with actors shaping international development agencies and financial institutions, it was often equated with the narrowly economistic. Empowerment traveled as individual financial empowerment with little attention to context, culture, and social relations. To this end, empowerment often got delinked from politics, and empowerment via income generation became a project of development knowledge. Thus, key actors in the development field developed methodologies to promote women's empowerment, such as lists of best practices for implementation of policy commitments to economic empowerment. Indeed, UN Women, the IMF, and the World Bank, amongst other agencies, have developed principles for women's empowerment in the family, workplace, marketplace, and community. The proliferation of knowledge claims about interventions that will achieve empowerment were also de facto knowledge claims about what empowerment looks like. As this process became consolidated in institutional practice, empowerment policy focused, among other things, on encouraging women's access to property title, credit, and entrepreneurship. And these three things will repeat. Property title, credit, and entrepreneurship is a repeat in the story that I'm going to tell. So let me say something briefly about each of those three programmatic goals, and we can come back to it later if people are interested. First, the promotion of individual property title gets incorporated into empowerment initiatives in a number of international organizations. Within the development field, the orthodoxy equates property rights with formalized commodifiable individual title, and this goal has pervaded women's empowerment through property. Women need access to commodifiable individual title, it was argued. In many contexts, indigent communities have found that informal but socially recognized occupancy, rights of residency, public housing, and alternative approaches to property rights have provided greater housing security and less dispossession than formal commodifiable individual title. However, the World Bank and other institutions have focused not on housing security, but on commodifiable title, and have led a campaign for formal titling programs in the name of what Hernando de Soto describes as legal empowerment, arguing that formal titling is the gateway to economic success and integration in the global market. So if title is one indicator of empowerment, as economic empowerment has also foregrounded the efforts to facilitate women's access to credit. So this is a second dimension. Thus, many development agencies have focused their post-conflict reconstruction efforts on increasing availability of credit to women, on removing restrictions of women's access to credit because of insufficient collateral, biases in the delivery of financial services, and other challenges they face in engaging fully as market actors. With structural adjustment programs thinning down the role of the state and state services while deregulating financial instruments, the 1990s saw increased popularity of microcredit schemes and other efforts to use the market for economic stimulus and service delivery with women as the primary targets of microcredit schemes, and empowerment-oriented market reform. By easing access to credit, these schemes were seen to provide a path to financial independence and the promise of empowerment. A third dimension of the dominant approach to empowerment, in addition to title and credit, is entrepreneurship. In particular, efforts to enable and encourage women's integration into the market. With an emphasis on individualism and agency, women's entrepreneurship, like microcredit and marketable individual property rights, also lodges nicely with the ideology of structural adjustment policies and the focus on private initiative rather than state intervention as the engine for economic growth. The convergence between these policy orientations and the discourses of empowerment in feminist development policy builds the effective structure tethering neoliberalism and feminism. The policy package of entrepreneurship, microcredit schemes, and individual property claims may have particular resonance with the discourse of empowerment and the promise of the professional leaning in for a woman to define her own future. So international conflict feminism is a second dimension of the feminism that informs this particular approach to empowerment. Within the field of international development, the international agencies dealing with violence and the threat of violence, such as it's invoked, for instance, in the World Bank's Unit for Fragile and Failed States, they treat violent conflict as akin to a fire that sweeps through a society and creates a fertile, depoliticized terrain for new beginnings. The dynamic that Naomi Klein has identified with crisis capitalism is more generally true for international interventions in countries deemed to be conflict zones. The conflict or post-conflict environment is often invoked as a failed state or a terra nullius that legitimizes external intervention to restore a model of governance that allows its people to march forward into history rather than be weighed down by primordial conflicts. And because gender mainstreaming has reached post-conflict international management, this domain also colors itself gender-sensitive, inclusive, and non-discriminatory. The power of this dynamic is that institutionalized knowledge about women's empowerment and post-conflict recovery has far-reaching structural and distributive effects. And it travels not as politics or ideology, but as gender-sensitive post-conflict reconstruction. UN Security Council Resolution 1325 on Women, Peace and Security, its birthing, life and legacy, offers an illustrative window into these dynamics. Passed by the Security Council in 2000, Resolution 1325 became a central pivot point for a range of agendas at the nexus of women, peace and security that I describe as international conflict feminism. The gendered subject who emerges from war and conflict in ICF policy depictions is represented as a particular kind of object of knowledge, classically both vulnerable and disempowered. The knowledge economies that attach to the representation of the post-conflict woman as vulnerable, but also resilient, facilitates interventions that shape and regulate through discourses of accountability, recovery, inclusion, and empowerment. That is accountability for sexual violence in war, where she's written as vulnerable, and recovery from war-related atrocities, inclusion in peace processes, and empowerment in post-conflict reconstruction efforts to prove her resilience. The focus on property, credit, and entrepreneurship as routes to empowerment gains particular traction in the context of post-conflict development policy. Privatization of state land and property law measures creating or entrenching fungible individual title have been a cornerstone of neoliberal economic development initiatives across the world. But the widespread displacement and destruction of war-torn countries have offered their advocates particularly fertile ground to lay a new foundation for free market activity by entrenching individual property rights. In a similar vein, mainstreaming gender into financial services, and particularly access to credit, has become a critical focus of feminist approaches to poverty reduction in post-conflict contexts. Finally, against a dominant story of women as victims of war, post-war economic policy is advanced as opening the possibility of a new dawn for exercising women's agency. Indeed, female entrepreneurship has been heralded as a peace-building tool, with donor programs aimed at trade between women across ethnic lines and market activity equated with reconciliation. Transitional contexts have been advanced as offering particularly hospitable ground for the notion of an empowered female actor who can attain economic emancipation by navigating the market in ways that are autonomous of context, culture, and background socioeconomic conditions. These three anchors of empowerment feed into each other. Title property ownership is promoted as enabling collateral to support credit access. Similarly, access to credit is promoted as critical for women's economic agency, and self-reliance as entrepreneurs driving market-oriented economic recovery in the conflict zone. So let me shift now to section 2. I'm moving fast between these so to get a window into each of the three sections. And section 2 focuses on the role and how this feminism unfolds in post-war Sri Lanka in relation to this particular project of housing reconstruction that I call ODHA. The 30-year civil war in Sri Lanka ended in 2009. Post-war Sri Lanka quickly emerged as a magnet for various recovery and reconstruction efforts. These initiatives were shaped by various policy traditions, including neoliberal development theory and feminism. The feminist insights that we saw most prominently were those that emerged from feminist development work, with the added inflection of ICF, International Conflict Feminism. Feminism was articulated in governance through these converging and intertwined traditions. Sri Lanka has a long feminist tradition and many indicators of women's well-being in social development parlance. However, over the years, there has been much discussion about how the celebrated social development indicators regarding gender equality in Sri Lanka understated women's disempowerment. This focus on empowerment gets heightened with the focus on conflict, with much discussion of female-headed households, war widows, and women's particular economic precarity in conflict and post-conflict environments. In this spirit, the World Bank says that there is an exacerbation of gender inequality in fragile and conflict-affected situations that require, the World Bank says, initiatives that boost women's agency and economic opportunities simultaneously. The bank goes on then to cite access to title, credit, and entrepreneurship as key elements of empowerment that combine the dual focus on agency and opportunity. The development field has conceived and designed a series of indices of women's empowerment that incorporate these elements and concomitant toolkits to foster entrepreneurship and best practices for gender equality in property ownership and access to credit. In other words, the field of post-conflict development assistance has also generated a knowledge apparatus regarding the economic, physical, and psychosocial vulnerabilities that female heads of households in northern Sri Lanka face in the post-war context. Against this backdrop, I move in the rest of this talk to focus on post-war housing reconstruction that was shaped by ICF analysis of the problem and the solution. So development experts saw housing as a linchpin to address many dimensions of the war in Sri Lanka, from internal displacement to economic recovery. The ODHA program was a development program intended to address this housing crisis. Moreover, in the name of promoting gender equality, ODHA, microcredit schemes, and entrepreneurship initiatives unfolded as parallel and mutually reinforcing policies that recognize and invested in women's agency. It is a product of a collaboration, ODHA is a product of a collaboration between the government of Sri Lanka, donor countries such as India, Australia, and members of the European Union, and multilateral agencies such as the World Bank and UN Habitat. ODHA had the promise of being responsive to community needs and was driven by a participatory model of housing reconstruction. And we can say more about that in the Q&A as well. However, as I will discuss, ODHA was accompanied by its own complexities and unintended outcomes. These complexities and unintended outcomes are the focus of my remarks of the next few minutes. ODHA sought to engender post-conflict reconstruction and economic recovery in previously war-torn regions of Sri Lanka through seed grants for individual home building. The grant was disbursed in installments throughout the course of the building program. Homeowners were expected to contribute their labor, oversight of the home building, and any supplementary costs incurred by housing plans that went beyond the prototype. Recipients were residents in war-torn areas whose homes had been destroyed. As the UN Habitat report on this housing program describes it, vulnerable groups, including female-headed households, elderly homeowners, and the disabled, were given priority assistance. Excuse me. Most households sought to supplement their ODHA seed grants by taking advantage of financial instruments, including microcredit schemes, offering and in fact encouraging credit, or have taken advantage of schemes encouraging entrepreneurial activities for income generation. Owner-driven housing entered the international donor repertoire not as a neoliberal policy, but as a populist participatory development initiative undertaken in Latin America in the 1960s. The critique of hierarchically planned programs resonates powerfully with the feminist critique of top-down development programs referenced earlier. The feminist path to development highlighted empowerment as a key goal linking socioeconomic transformation to popular participation, and housing was seen as a critical avenue for such empowerment. ODHA advocates were seen to foreground homeowners as empowered architects of their housing rights, not beneficiaries of government largesse. ODHA originally emerged among grassroots activists interested in participatory development and creative approaches to leveraging the non-monetary resources and capacities of the poor. Today, ODHA has become part of the policy package of the most powerful development institutions in the world, adapting to a policy environment shaped by structural adjustment programs and attendant ideas of entrepreneurship and market-driven growth and the individualizing of responsibility and risk. The ODHA program in Sri Lanka unfolded in the former war zones alongside a range of ICF-accented empowerment-focused initiatives. In 2011, the Sri Lankan government estimated that there were approximately 60,000 female-headed households in the most war-affected regions of the north and east of the country, with some suggestion that the numbers were even greater and that the data collection process was ongoing. For instance, the Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, a government body, highlighted women's economic precarity, noting in particular that war widows were the poorest of the poor, and their special needs must be taken into account as a matter of priority. In fact, some international commentators have argued that the government was underestimating the burden borne by women. In a 2015 report, the UN office in Sri Lanka recommended that women-headed households require recognition as a group that has specific economic and social vulnerabilities, which warrant very specific interventions. Thus, ODHA programs in Sri Lanka needed to be situated in relation to the dual policy agendas highlighted earlier: post-conflict development assistance on the one hand and women's empowerment on the other. ODHA emerged against this backdrop where there was not only a focus on increased allocation of aid to women, but also aid allocation within an empowerment framework that made the targeted women drivers of the process. ODHA was one of a range of interlinked ICF-informed policy initiatives, mainstreaming women's involvement and empowerment in a post-conflict setting. Within the ICF policy vision of economic empowerment, one can see ODHA as ideally structured to serve several goals. In offering housing grants disbursed through several installments, it allows, it claimed, the recipients to have considerable control over housing construction. Relatedly, in focusing on privatizing housing rights, it gives recipients a path to individual title. Although ODHA was not directed at women alone, the changing demographics of the post-war context meant that female-headed households were amongst the most important recipients. In addition, housing was seen as significant in offering collateral for women's access to credit. Thus, discourse on the needs of female-headed households and the vulnerability of war widows has been accompanied by an investment in female economic empowerment, such that, in the words of one agency, these women should be looked at not only as recipients of aid, but also as participants in the development and reconciliation process. So let me move now to my last and the third section, and basically the unhappy news. These interlinked policy initiatives of female empowerment and economic reconstruction have engendered a debt and dispossession title. A 2014 study suggested that 85% of ODHA households had acquired significant household debt that had already caused or threatened dispossession of key household resources. 2/3 of this debt was acquired entirely to supplement the ODHA house building grant. It is not that ODHA was a singular catalyst for this debt, but that ODHA came in a climate of a range of interventions focused on women's access to credit and entrepreneurship, reduced government expenditure on public housing, the deregulation of financial instruments, and aggressive loan inducements. These factors converged to produce a dynamic that carried its own momentum of debt and precarity. Individual property ownership has also meant individualized property development costs. For the vast majority of beneficiaries, the costs have exceeded ODHA seed grants. Banks and other financial service agencies were liberal with credit approvals and encouraged people to take out loans even if the terms of repayment were exorbitant and there was little prospect of secure income to pay back those loans in a timely manner. The financial desperate of prospective debtors made it a predator's creditors market. Loans eased the short-term credit crunch while heightening long-term financial precarity. As one commentator notes, the interest rates for mortgage houses were around 120% per year. But the war-affected women tried their utmost to repay these loans. Fear of losing their homes has led to them cutting down on food. Thus, housing precarity and financial precarity compound the precarity of life itself. The majority of debtors have been unable to service their debt without taking out further loans and pawning or sometimes losing valuable family resources. The irony is that this has not led to housing security. Families who lost their homes to shells and mortars in the civil war that engulfed their communities are now at risk of losing their home to debt and loan payments in what may describe as an economic war on the poor. For these households, debt is both enabler and constraint. In a resource-constrained context, debt offers resources that promises to meet basic needs for shelter and livelihood. But the debt and its interest exacerbates resource constraints and fuels the need for even more debt. Thus, for many, spiraling into greater and greater debt has become a way of life, coping with and compounding the impossibility of everyday life. With the empowerment model ensuring that women were particularly significant beneficiaries of post-conflict economic policy, this dynamic of debt and dispossession has rendered female-headed households particularly vulnerable. As already noted, many development agencies have long thought of access to credit as a key barrier to individual economic empowerment. In this context, microcredit schemes have flourished, particularly microcredit schemes targeting poor women and others seen to have the greatest challenges in accessing credit on favorable terms. The housing schemes often saw microcredit as a complementary adjunct to the housing grants. The post-war period in Sri Lanka has also seen the proliferation of these particular schemes, of microcredit-based self-employment schemes, where women in particular are encouraged to become entrepreneurs by becoming a freelance seamstress, for instance, by using microcredit for the initial purchase of the sewing machine or whatever capital investment is needed to get the business off the ground. Yet profit margins for these income generation projects are thin and can barely sustain day-to-day life, let alone repayment of loans or supplementing ODHA grants to build a home. Thus, here too, self-employment schemes have often led to entrapment in cycles of debt. Entrepreneurship has meant income insecurity for a community that is already grappling with poverty. Women's empowerment has been mainstreamed into these policies, advancing home ownership, access to credit, and entrepreneurship to ensure that these policy initiatives reach female beneficiaries. However, this inclusive capitalism has often heightened the precarity of these same women and their households. The scheme is based on cruel optimism. Debt overwhelms the everyday life of these post-war communities as they navigate the crisis ordinariness of post-conflict economic governance. From household debt to sovereign debt, debt is not a backup option when routine budgets fall short. Rather, debt is itself routinized into budgeting. The routine attains crisis proportions because of the nested dynamic of debt at different scales. For instance, Sri Lanka is mired deeply in a sovereign debt crisis and has taken out additional loans from the International Monetary Fund to make payments on its existing loans and supplement existing revenue. With over 95% of government revenue needed for servicing its existing debts, the country has reduced its expenditure on public goods, such as state-constructed housing, and encouraged the role of private financial institutions and concomitantly private household debt. Such policies are encouraged by IMF loan conditionalities constraining public spending. The viciously impoverishing debt cycles of these household economies and the proportion of household revenue feeding debt payments mirror how sovereign debt operates for the national economy. Moreover, tracking how the factors shape the personal debt crisis of individual households is exacerbated by the factors shaping sovereign debt crisis, offers a telling window into how dispossession trickles down. Personal debt crisis has its own spread effects, catalyzing a chain of additional debt. For instance, impoverishment within Sri Lanka often pushes those who can get contract jobs in the Middle East or elsewhere to send remittances that can help with large expenses, such as building houses. In fact, remittances from these workers, primarily domestic workers and construction workers, are the single biggest source of foreign exchange in the country. Foreign currency that is even more valuable because the structural adjustment entailed currency devaluation of the Sri Lankan rupee. Significantly, the recruitment and wage systems into these employment schemes, such as the kafala system, require workers to undertake significant debt to pay the employment agency a recruitment fee that they then earn back in monthly increments to their work. Moreover, in recent years, countries such as the United Kingdom have instituted schemes of visa bonds that function as significant financial loans held as security by the visa granting country to be returned only when the person returns to Sri Lanka. Here, traveling bodies function as financial tethers to loans structured on the terms of the visa. Debt is a technique of governance that shapes and exploits vulnerability. In fact, by enabling immediate survival through deferred credit, it also deepens vulnerability by financializing it. Sri Lanka, of course, is not alone in suffering debt as a modality of governance. From Detroit to Athens, crisis ordinariness via debt is the order of the day. A 2016 IMF study titled Debt, Use It Wisely, found that the global debt of the non-financial sector, comprising the general government, households, and non-financial firms, is currently at an all-time high. Margaret Atwood describes debt as being almost like the air we breathe. It is everywhere. Crisis ordinariness is part of the atmosphere. Yet not everyone is affected by the air in the same way. The crisis dimensions of debt condense and diffuse differently for the lender and the borrower of both household debt and sovereign debt in the global north and the global south. The Jubilee movement from 2000 and the critique of debt associated with the Occupy movement 10 years later, international law arguments for the forgiveness of what is referred to as odious debt, these are all varied touchstones of global struggles against the debt crisis. In Sri Lanka too, as these programs unfolded and the debt crisis intensified, there has been increased momentum in the struggles against predatory lending and microcredit schemes. Of particular note here are the marches and protests by women and men in these communities protesting existing microcredit schemes, calling for the state to cap interest rates for future loan programs, and organizing cooperatives that speak to alternative visions of economic futures that strained against this conscription into the crisis ordinariness of hegemonic market logics. These efforts have had some traction with state officials, and the government has announced a jubilee of sorts, namely debt forgiveness for women in war-affected communities with loans of up to 100,000 rupees and a cap on interest rates for future loans. These measures do not constitute long-term structural change, affecting conditions of precarity. But the combination of debt forgiveness and the promise of lower interest rates for future debt is likely to provide immediate and critical relief for the beneficiaries. The cruel ironies engendered by this prolonged crisis are such that debt is both problem and solution. We are reminded again of the difficulty that Balan describes of detaching from these compromised conditions of possibility. The challenges of debt-fueled economies of empowerment are ongoing. However, even the arc of the story in post-war Sri Lanka thus far presses the need for critical reflection regarding this particular brand of feminism and the policies it has engendered, intended, and unintended. In this talk, I've sought to analyze the infrastructure of crisis ordinariness in environments undergoing post-war reconstruction, and concomitantly to probe the politics of female empowerment as mobilized in this context. The affective structure that it draws on and engenders is shaped in a dialectic between crisis and stability, despair and promise, austerity and consumption, discipline and empowerment. It inflects what we could describe as a techno-moral appeal of this fusion of technocratic language of law and policy with moral pronouncements. This is central to legitimizing prescriptions as being in the public interest. UN Habitat's reports on the housing scheme includes profiles of women who were chosen to be recipients of these grants and describes them as feeling empowered. Female-headed households, it says, empowered to take charge of the construction of their houses, feel its, UN Habitat argues, a sense of achievement on completion. Feminist arguments for empowerment that claim this affective resonance were integrated with techno-moral programs for private sector promotion. Thus fused, these policy commitments ensured that local and global development programs were attached to neoliberal agendas for post-war economic recovery. In Undoing the Demos, Wendy Brown has argued that the power of neoliberalism is best understood not as economic policies for exploitation and profit, but as a more insidiously micro-political rationality. Neoliberalization, she says, is generally more termite-like than lion-like. Its mode of reason boring in capillary fashion into the trunks and branches of workplaces, schools, public agencies, social and political discourse, and above all, the subject. There is an important resonance here with the path that empowerment discourse has traveled, where market logics have integrated with discourses and strategies that articulate dissonance and heterodoxy. Central to the economy of desire here is its mutuality. Empowerment and neoliberal development married agendas and visions to richer and poorer, including richer promises and poorer futures. The policies advanced by post-conflict development apparatus can themselves exacerbate economic vulnerability in post-conflict environments. Indeed, as in the cases studied here, the female empowerment programs that are lodged in these development policies can be instrumental in these dynamics. In such cases, empowerment is not just an empty promise, but rather it trades in a currency of cruel optimism, where the promise of empowerment is part of the very apparatus that disempowers further. The Sri Lankan example draws attention to the striking tension between the feminism's success in shaping policy in the name of empowerment on the one hand, and the exacerbation of women and men's economic vulnerability through these very policies on the other. Moreover, as these policies get normalized into mainstream development policy, the precarity engendered by the legacies of conflict and exacerbated by hegemonic development policy become a constant, where the development policy apparatus legitimates itself by contrasting its promises with the precarity of war. When crisis becomes ordinary in this way, these enabling conditions also become more difficult to challenge. Indeed, this normalization of precarity makes it more difficult to imagine an alternative ordinary. Cruel optimism.
Thank you for that, Vasuki. So it's a pleasure because we've actually known each other for several years and haven't actually gotten a chance to engage with each other's work or thinking. So this is really nice. So I really enjoyed this piece, and my responses might seem a little bit all over the place, but this is really just because of where Vasuki's paper and talk has sort of led me. And I also want to say something that Karen didn't say, which was I was once a student in this very class. And I think maybe in the very first iteration of this class. And so I remember it well, and I remember these talks being something that I really looked forward to. So thank you guys for letting me back in this form. So as Karen said, my work is focused on Puerto Rico, which has everything to say about debt. So when I was reading the paper, among the things that most struck me is this idea that to be a sort of proper citizenship, you have to be an indebted citizen, right? So that exercising a full citizenship right is somehow linked to ideas of property ownership, which is not unlike ideas of putting proper use to land, right, and why we have justified certain divestments of land, indigenous land in particular, right. There are certain people who don't know how to sort of use property in its rightful way, and so we are charged with teaching them, right. So I think it's very useful to consider the language of development and the language of empowerment in development as a language that is promoting ideas of what it is to be a proper citizen and how that correct engagement with rights and citizenship demands debt, produces it, but also demands it. And so then where does that leave the sort of indebted citizen when they fail, right? So when the policies break down, as they do in Sri Lanka, this ODHA policy, how does that leave a sort of idea of a failed citizenship, right? Within the individual, within the community, and I would say within the project. So part of what I'm most interested in is the way that debt produces a type of emotional, affective relationship with debt, right? So we all have a sense that we must pay debt. And that relationship that we've been sort of taught that we have to pay it, right? It produces a sort of emotional bond. So what happens then when you fail, right? And when the policy that is sort of implemented in some ways envisions you failing, right? Because debt relies on more debt, right? It's not the case that we create debt so that you will pay it off and then ta-da, you're done, right? It only works if you are further indebted. So that there's this, again, the cruel relationship, the cruel optimism of sort of the language of empowerment, the rhetoric of empowerment that would offer a solution through debt only to sort of set you up to fail, right? Because it requires you to be further indebted for it to work. Another thing that really struck me about this paper is the idea of the kind of feminizing or feminine understanding of, in Vasuki's paper, women in particular as victims and vulnerable, and their salvation through economic empowerment, right, and economic policies, which as a historian, I'm really struck by the way that this mirrors colonial logics throughout the 20th century, right, that saw certain parts of the world as vulnerable and in need of salvation, and thus in need of intervention, economic, military, and all the sort of forms of interventions that we know, as a way of facilitating what is essentially capital expansion, right? So that, again, historically, we have this notion that there are certain populations that are vulnerable and perhaps unsophisticated in how economics and capitalism work. And there is this sort of Western or neoliberal, or however you want to think about it, imperative to educate these certain peoples, these certain places, through economic policy and capitalist expansion and ultimately debt creation. And these places, these people, right, so it's been, I'm thinking of Latin America and the Caribbean as geographies that have been feminized in this way, and the developing world as geographies that are feminized in ways, right, places that are in need of intervention and salvation. And that this is cyclical, right? It looks slightly different, but it is more or less shades of the same thing, shades of the same sort of colonial practices. So ultimately, the question that I asked myself again and again, and Vasuki's paper raised it, is why are certain people made to be debtors, right? We sort of function with this logic that certain people have to be in debt. And I think we understand, right, and this is where the racial capitalism sort of underlies your discussion, right? It's not up front and center. But historically, certain people are always made to be debtors. And if we think about those who are currently indebted, right, so right this moment, Haiti is sort of uprising, right? And in many ways, it's because of this sort of continual sovereign debt that is repackaged and repackaged and repackaged. And means that that particular country can never sort of bring itself out of that debt, historic debt, right? Debt that has existed for centuries, and really. Puerto Rico is also an example of this sort of repackaging of debt And the conclusion is that then this moment of crisis allows for a kind of reconfiguring of the debt under the guise of crisis intervention, of empowerment, of moving, of erasing what had existed before and bringing us to something perhaps better, more empowered. And then the last thing that I was thinking about, and you said that debt is routinized and is the technique of governance. And I think it really interesting because when you were talking about SAPs in the paper, you talked about the state abrogating its sort of governance to some of these international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, right? And in other ways, and again, in the case of Puerto Rico, what we see is governance being sort of given over to capital. And so what does it mean to have debt as a technique of governance when in many ways the state has abrogated its function of governance to economic markets, to global capital? And then where does that lead us with sovereign debt? We understand sovereign debt being state debt taken on by sovereign entities. In the case of Puerto Rico, the irony of sovereign debt is that Puerto Rico is not a sovereign, and so what does that actually even mean in a place that's a colony? But I think it's an interesting sort of tension of language, but also leads us to really useful and important questions about what do we mean when we say sovereign debt? What is becoming of sovereign debt in a system where sovereignty is sort of being abrogated to capitalism or capital? Okay, and I will stop there. Thank you, Vasuki, and thank you, Karen, and thank you.
Thank you both. I have to say I was listening to Vasuki's talk, thinking about Puerto Rico, partly because I knew you were responding, but also just from there were so many similarities in dynamics that even in very different situations that we will have a chance to get to. But the students get to ask the first question or two, and then we'll open it up. This is Sidonia.
Oh, thank you for your response.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you so much for your talk and for being here. Sorry, I hope you can understand me. I'm a little sick. You mentioned early on that one of the sort of unspoken incorporations of the paper is this link to affective economies, and Dr. Jimenez, you talked about this as well, but I was wondering if you could expand on that for us a little bit.
Oh, sure. Should I get a few first?
Yeah, and also I don't know if you want to. Yeah, maybe you take a couple and also see if you can respond to Monica.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Sorry, I asked you to get up there. So, hey, you want to come sit over here?
Yeah, or we can both stand and I suppose.
Mrs. Kelly.
Hi.
Thank you so much for being here. In your paper and in your talk, you spoke about how through kind of the evolution, the discourse of empowerment, how it's kind of been delinked from a lot of really important political, social, cultural norms. And I was wondering if you could expand on, particularly in Sri Lanka, what that would have looked like to have maybe some of those social, cultural nuances actually involved in like the empowerment discourse, how perhaps what that would have changed and what those nuances could have provided that's really been missing from the context of empowerment.
Probably enough for you.
Sure. Okay, so maybe I'll start with the last one then, about empowerment, how empowerment may have been different in the Sri Lankan. So, I mean, as I mentioned sort of, very briefly here, that of course Sri Lanka has had a long history of a feminist movement, and and aimed at a whole different range of different kinds of things, but including, of course, sustainable livelihoods and so on, in some sense, this post-war intervention has changed. I mean, one of the things that it does is many of those, it delinks in some sense the notion of intervention. It reframes feminism, to put it briefly, is something that comes in from the outside. Outside of the particular traditions of feminism that have developed within Sri Lanka. that were linked to the peace movement, that were, and had a whole range of different alternative kinds of history linked to the Sri Lanka had a long Trotskyite tradition for at one point largest Trotskyite party in the world, I think, even though it's such a small country. But and so it is which took feminism very seriously. So in Sri Lanka, when Sri Lanka got the franchise, it was a universal franchise for men and women. There was a whole range of things that were part of the, but you sort of grow up learning as part of the feminist tradition in Sri Lanka. In this post-conflict context, however, all the interventions get reframed as this is a conflict zone. And a conflict zone is a zone without politics. It's a zone where, in fact, you're bringing emancipation from the outside. And in fact, my favorite example of this is that the European Union, for instance, if you want to apply for a grant from European Union, as many local groups had to do for funding, you had to you had to frame whatever you were going to do in relation to Security Council 1325 that was passed in 2000. That's what the one I mentioned. So it meant that it gets the shifting it rather than the local context and the local traditions, including the South Asian traditions. Not only, the Sri Lankan feminist movement also grew, of course, in conversation with feminist movements in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and so on. It gets dealing from those traditions or from the broader traditions of the global South that's indicated by, say, the Mexico 1975 meeting and so on that emerged, and becomes instead something that is referenced by 1325 and the Security Council in New York. So there's a way, it's in that way that it becomes somehow something that is sort of global and retrofitted into a particular notion of empowerment, particular notion about where feminism is coming from and what feminism means, what is the kind of global subject that it's calling forth and so on. All of that shifts. So does that okay? Yeah, okay. Okay, so then the question of affective economies. Yeah, I guess I want to, it's partly it's partly why I sort of start with Ballant as well in terms of thinking about cruel optimism, is that way that debt functions. It is, there are different kinds of things function differently, and that part of the logic of this is that it keeps promising, and it's partly how it's sold as well as the way in which, as something that is a solution, as something that engenders optimism in some sense. So there's a whole there's a significance of affect there that is part of not only economic discourse about the promises of credit and title and entrepreneurship, but also the promises of feminism, because feminism also in some sense tethers its particular notion of emancipation and empowerment to particular notions of to this particular particular possibilities of debt in this particular crisis. But also I would want to say sort of broader discussions. Like in the lunch discussion, people were asking about TWAIL and the question of anger that is one element of TWAIL in some sense. And I think so affect is also important in that sense. And, I've written this paper like 10,000 years ago, and I have read it and now revised it again. But I felt myself getting angry even while I was reading it to you guys, yet again. So I feel it's like there's a sense in which I want to be able to link the particular ways in which we speak about economic analysis to the kinds and protest and the resistance to it, also through those kinds of things. So, and positive ones as well. So like the example what I ended on, there has been now, there's a movement against that. There's in fact, there's something called the women's cooperative movement. The northern part of Sri Lanka also has a tradition of cooperatives, of economic cooperatives. And they have now, in that post-war context, recreated. And they have called for a moratorium on all microcredit agencies and asked for them not to give out loans. So it's a call by a community group. It's not the law, but in a context where there's no financial the financial regulation has been so neglected or so undermined in some sense by state policy or by international agencies. This notion of an alternative notion of solidarity and a different vision of a future, all of that in some sense is part of what I want to invoke as well, in terms of thinking about the affect as both in terms of what both in the politics of oppression and the politics of resistance in a whole range of different kinds of ways. And Monica, I mean, I think it's exactly right. I think when you're focused on thinking about citizenship as itself something that is predicated on debt, I find that quite compelling. I mean, and I think in this particular it's interesting, I suppose, to see the different kinds of, to go back to different kinds of framings, political frames that are invoked and mobilized in different kinds of contexts. In Sri Lanka, it wasn't. It was, to some extent, it was citizenship, but it was language of reconciliation, post-war recovery, and so on. And I can see, of course, in the U.S., definitely citizenship and property ownership are so deeply intertwined in many ways. In Sri Lanka, the property regimes that are initiated by this comes in a context where people had been struggling, landless had been struggling for a long time against the World Bank's prescription for privatizing property rights. So there's a whole parts of low-wage agricultural labor in rural Sri Lanka. They don't have commodified property rights. They don't have title, but they have occupancy rights, and they all basically farm small plots. And they also came. So there's a farm workers union, as it were, and they also protested, and in a way that similar landless groups have protested, I think, in Brazil and South Africa and elsewhere, protested against policies that were being drawn up in their name to grant property rights. And in Sri Lanka, in this particular moment, partly through a language of recovery. As soon as the war ended, in fact, even in the 2000 before the war ended, there was a brief sort of ceasefire window in the early 2000s between when the Norwegian peace process was taking place, and the World Bank immediately pushed this particular privatization of land, giving people property rights. They don't call it privatization; they call it giving people property rights. About giving, essentially a Thatcherite kind of scheme of ensuring that these people who had occupancy rights could commodify their occupancy, and in ways, and people of course know that this is going to only bring housing insecurity and land insecurity, and they protested in a huge way. So it is So I think the frame of citizenship also is really helpful in thinking of as I said, in Sri Lanka, it's property ownership of the kind that you have in the U.S. is less tied to the national ideological ethos in some sense about what it means to be an American. It doesn't mean the same thing. Owning your white picket fence, it's not the same thing in Sri Lanka. But economic recovery is, and reconstruction is. So that's, in some sense, the language of mobilization there.
So I think going off of that, I've been thinking about both your discussion as well as Monika's response, and I've been thinking a lot of disaster capitalism.
Yeah.
And how corporations go into, disaster, either post-natural disasters or post-war contexts, and start buying up land. And I wanted to see if in Sri Lanka there's been something similar, or what you've seen in other post-war contexts with disaster capitalism.
So, thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it. So, what I've heard, a lot of what you've written, and also a lot of other places, is that there's just so much greed and corruption that comes along with the microcredit schemes once they arrive. And so, what I'm wondering is there a place for small amounts of microcredit in ways that are done with NGOs or governments that do in fact have the people's best interest at heart? So in a world where you could filter out all of the 120% loans, is there a place in economies that may not be as prone to sort of the types of credit schemes found in microcredit? Is there a place to put those in small doses like this?
Cool.
Okay, I have two questions. It's really, it was wonderful what you said, and then I said to go over the next side, if it's okay.
Oh yeah.
The first one is I'm not a lawyer, I'm not even a social scientist.
Neither am I.
Okay, So when we talk about the affective economy of cruel optimism in this instance, is like, where do you archive it? So I'm like, is there a hidden ethnographic component to this? Because I think that you're setting it up as structural. So I can see how the promise, the indebtedness is delivered as structural, but I don't really see anywhere how we know what people are actually feeling. So is there a submerged ethnographic component? That movement you just described, the moratorium movement, that looks to be like a place where maybe that their public pronouncement, one could find it. Because I just think, I'm just curious to know, does it look the same when it's felt as it does in the structure? Or might there be a slight difference? And then the other, and then the second one is more just of an observation. And it actually, I mean, this to me sounds a lot like Indian allotments in the history of the colonization of this country, where actually in the early 20th century, the U.S. government decides actually they're just going to give each Indian in a reservation an allotment. And the whole point of it is so it can then become alienable. It can be bought and sold, and actually in the name of empowerment, and actually, so the racial capitalism element, it feels to me very much of a piece of a long history of using private land title as a promise, but actually the consequence is dispossession. So sure, why don't the empowerment people know this? I mean, are the empowerment people just dupes, or are the empowerment people actually really bad at what they want? I mean, what's the sorry, okay.
So I'm gonna, to tie them together a little bit, I think they're tied together, but I was going to ask, so in the motive for disaster capitalism, is if you'd say a little bit more about, but it's actually helpful, these three questions, who benefits? So I think it would be helpful for us to have a better sense of who benefits effectively, otherwise, from the various schemes.
Okay, cool. So for the first question on the disaster capitalism, yes, there have been many private companies that have, since the tsunami, in the early years, first couple of decades of the war, it was less so, but from the time the tsunami happened, which was I think 2004, right? You had these suddenly massive, massive hotels and hotel chains that bought up beachfront property all around the island. And I think that was sort of the first encounter. And now you find the second encounter that is mixed in some sense. That you have both private companies, and you find what we didn't have earlier in Sri Lanka, a certain corporate military convergence. So you have the model that you see, or something like the model that you see in Pakistan or in Egypt, where strong militaries and are involved in doing things like running gas stations, or in claiming. So there was what remains in Sri Lanka a controversy in some parts of the north is what's defined as a high security zone, and there's no really security. I mean, there's no security problem anymore in Sri Lanka except from all of these actors, the powerful actors in the thing. But it has been used as a way for the military to make a land grab. And of course, that's embedded in sort of some of those very same issues that propel the conflict in the first place in terms of just basic inter-ethnic injustice and vulnerable communities that become even more vulnerable. And the displacements of war have made all of that much more, have rendered that vulnerability even more, because many people who had to, of course, leave because of the war. And so it happens at different kinds of scales. Individual families go back to find another family also displaced from somewhere else that's now occupying their home, to these large-scale macro schemes of disaster capitalism. So in that context, of course, there are big private actors that benefit, that the military benefits, the state benefits. In the microcredit schemes, there are different levels of financial beneficiaries. The banks that are giving out these loans benefit because they are reaping enormous amount of enormous amount of profits from these things because people are, they have mortgaging everything to pay back these loans, or the government is bailing them out in a whole range of different kinds of ways. And then the international banks benefit as well, right? So there's been, so in addition to sort of Puerto Rico and Haiti, the current events in Lebanon as well are also about this debt cycles where local internal debt, I think I read somewhere that something like 50% of Lebanese debt is internal debt like this, right? And then, so each gets embedded in and then overall debt is even greater than Sri Lanka. It's like the third worst in the world or something. Each level of debt gets embedded in yet another cycle of financial financial actors. And so at each of those levels, someone is benefiting. All of those lenders are benefiting, whether it is like the local bank that's going around village by village saying, we'll give you a loan at these whatever thing and we can give you the money tomorrow. You just sign right here, to the international banks that to which where the country is bonded. And then you can of course make an argument about the global north and the global south in terms of what this system. One of the things I think of and again, to go back to the earlier racial capitalism, world systems, and so on, is that thinking of it this way in terms of all of these nested layers of things and the broader histories of colonialism, slavery, and so on that have produced particular kinds of vulnerabilities and then exploited them and built on them, is that it takes debt out of bilateral relationship between a lender and a borrower to be able to situate it in a system, a global economic system. And I think that's part of the effort in terms of thinking about disaster capitalism is not just temporary opportunism, but it's part of what the system is designed to engender in some sense, right? And in a sense, I think that is actually a insight of, well, of course, Marxism, but world systems definitely, as thinking about not thinking of even the colonial relationship as being the colonizer and the colonized, but thinking this is actually a system. So there are beneficiaries at many different different scales, in some sense. Okay, the second one was about is a microcredit that works? Well, the problem with microcredit, one of the problems in microcredit in this particular context is that it individualizes the risk and responsibility in a context where individuals are actually forced into greater and greater crisis, right? So they, but one of the visions of the cooperative movement has been to collectivize risk and responsibility, right? So some people have, so in a sense that actually, in one, this is what the Bangladeshis and what they argue was the original vision of at least their model of microcredit was that their social capital is not only about generating capital, but also that people will have your back, right? That you're not building your house alone and taking out loans alone, but you're collectivizing that kind of risk. And so I think, in a sense, it's not about whether microcredit works or not. I would like to shift that question, but the question actually shifts us into this terrain of how can we think of a way in which if risk is an inevitable part of any kind of investment, including us building shelter, how do we socialize that risk? How do we ensure that risk is not on the individual risk taker, especially the vulnerable individual risk taker, right? So it's about redistributing that risk, right? So I think it's useful, I think, to think about what could make this work in any particular context. How can we collectivize it at different contexts? And presumably that too, one can think of it, it's about figuring out at each layer where the political opportunities are to cooperatize in that particular kind of particular way. Okay, so and then the last question was Neville's about but whether there's an ethnography. This is there's no huge ethnography behind it. What I looked at in terms of looking at things are things like how groups like UN Habitat or these various donor agencies like the Germans and all these guys, how the kind of brochures they produce indicating their success. So there's sort of a textual analysis. And then there are local journalists and local activists who have been, from whom I've learned about the cooperative movement. There's a great article, for those of you interested, a little short blog piece in Open Democracy about these cooperative movements in Sri Lanka, the pushback against debt, and sort of their version of it's like a micro jubilee movement, plus but most interestingly as a cooperative movement, as an alternative economic vision. But all of those speak in different kinds of ways to the question of affect. But certainly all of the brochures that like UN Habitat produces, it's all of happy women in front of their homes, with saying and showing off their keys or their children playing in front of the house or whatever, and saying this is what your money is going to. I mean, I guess it's directed towards the donor agency. I mean, each scale is showing up. So so that's in a sense my data on the affect. In addition, there have now been various local think tanks that have done the ethnographic work. So some of the reports that I cite they are from Center for Poverty Alternatives. I think poverty analysis. It can't be alternatives. A different way of being poor. Now, they I think they have a lot of interviews with people who have got debt, who speak, for instance, about pawning. So this is a Tamil community where the huge issue of gold jewelry, even for people who are running from war, becomes very important, and they speak about having to pawn their gold jewelry that they got from their grandmother, and those kinds of things, or they don't have enough dowry for their children. I mean, those. So all of that is there, and about why and why the loan was so attractive, right? There was one more part of your question, I think, right? Did I? Oh, whether they empower people. Are good. So yeah, I don't know whether those are good guys or bad guys, or like what they feel. But I mean, this particular version of this thing comes in a chapter of governance feminism. I do think that having worked, for instance, in this international conflict feminism, feel like as a subject in the field, if I can report up to you ethnographers, I would say that the sense of being able to shape policy is a hugely empowering field for the feminists who are saying, oh, we got language in there about prioritizing women, or we were able to ensure that they counted female-headed households when they were looking at things, or we were able to get gender disaggregated data, or we were able, or do you know that the access to credit issues for women who don't have property are really bad? And I mean, so there's certainly sort of an affective benefit for feminists who are involved in the policymaking, I think, and the sense of empowerment that those feminists feel, as in terms of shaping what the story is. And then I know in terms of the bankers and so on, I don't know. I have no data at all. It of course feels predatory, and they all seem like mini Trump real estate tycoons. But that's just random speculation. Yeah.
Have there been examples of post-conflict countries that have had the latitude with which to embrace a housing security model rather than private home ownership? And what has been both the successes and I guess pitfalls of that approach too?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about the programs, but I do like this owner-driven housing thing. What came from, if I understand it, in Peru after the earthquake in the 60s, and then developed in the 60s and 70s through Latin America in different places. And that came initially, a bit like microcredit came as a sort of as a local approach rather than a global approach, and it came through protests against the older approaches to post-disaster disaster housing construction that came with plans from outside. And in fact, Sri Lanka has had that too. I mean, this same area of the north, I mean, this is, the program I described maybe dire, but there was an even more dire version as well. And the more dire version was where they gave the contract, through some corruption deal that was later on revealed, through some crazy company, company that was purely exploitative, and that built like aluminium houses that both were impossible to live in that heat, but also collapsed after the first whatever and first rainstorm or something. So the Peru with the owner-driven housing emerged as a participatory bottom-up alternative to those top-down versions that were either driven by corporate profit or by, to use James Scott's language, seeing like a state, right? That was not attentive to local needs and local participation and so on. So I guess, so I don't know how much these succeeded, but there certainly was, felt like that when little bit of reading I've done on the history of this particular approach to housing that has now become adapted by the World Bank and by all these other agencies, is that it came out of a grassroots transgressive impulse in some sense against an older model of post-crisis housing development. So, yeah.
This is something that came in our classroom discussion also. We were curious about what are the legal changes that was made in Sri Lanka to effectuate this policy, and also what was the recovery mechanism, where they drafted like a debt recovery tribunal of sorts, or like how did the state attempt the recovery?
Yeah. So. So there were I don't describe it in this thing, but there were various kinds of rules, some sort of very ad hoc in that immediate post-war context that were drafted to loosen restrictions on access to credit, so that banks and so on were able to then, and various, there was a proliferation of new credit-giving agencies, new little mini banks of some kind, or lending agencies that were then, so there was a financial deregulation. There was a whole range of legal things around financial deregulation that allowed the provision of credit. And then I think this may have come through a parliamentary legislation as well, this housing scheme, Empowering House Scheme, because it gave, I think there was various international agencies that were part of this, but I think the Indian government may have been, and the UN Habitat took the lead in shaping what this policy was, which also I think may have required some parliamentary legislation making it happen. And so I think all of those things, in terms of recovery, also I don't think there's been done a recovery except this bill for limiting, that was an act of parliament. And the way that happened was the women who were affected, they lobbied hard, their local representatives, various all the reports that I mentioned, all of those NGOs, they did this partly as an effort to try and get the government and local members of parliament to take some action to provide relief because the situation was so terrible. So, because it was, the very same people who had then suffered and been displaced by war then had this particular thing. So that particular relief, it was seen as a first step. I don't think there has been other steps that have been taken since then. But that first step was supposed to be immediate relief for those who had loans of a particular financial range, and then so it was supposed to address the most vulnerable, like a stopgap solution, at least for them, while thinking about things. The cooperative people they are interested in making, they want more, I guess partly legal and institutional support for cooperative solutions. So Jaffna in particular has had a long tradition of cooperatives, of consumer cooperatives, producer cooperatives, and so on. And particularly in the agricultural and fishing sectors, and they want to, there's been a mini revival of that. Those have now functioned partly as sort of freelance unions, but they are trying to get more institutional support for that as well, which also would be a legal change. So.
So I'm thinking about this in relationship to Monica's responses, and at some level there all these similarities, but you're positioning this in the post-conflict context, and your response to one of the earlier questions was about how that becomes also, it's seen as a no politics, neutral political zone. And yet crisis seems to be, and I think you want to use the word crisis when you were actually thinking about the crisis around debt, I think when you said it. You then mentioned the tsunami, right, which is
Sure.
not coming in the same context. So I guess I'd I'd love to hear you say a little bit more, like I really love how you bring the development, you have a trajectory around development and trajectory on post-conflict, and they intersect at this moment. But I'm wondering, how is it done differently in non-post-conflict settings?
Right.
So how does, because you would have the same, you could make the same argument about how particular moments or places get seen as non-political, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, you can see
Absolutely.
that with all of the kinds of
Yeah.
economic
Yeah.
development processes
Yeah.
coming from these same institutions. So is it just an opportunity? Is there a particular focus then, like on war veterans, I mean on widows of veterans? Is it, is that how gender comes in more here? What's different?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether, I'm sure there are lots of resonances and a lot of similarities. I mean, here, I focus on international conflict feminism because, in a sense, that is the specifics of it's just by tracing the specifics of the context through which the way things happen in Sri Lanka in this particular moment. In a context, against a background context where as you know, I have an argument about the way in which global feminism took a particular turn post-Cold War in a way that empowered what I think of as conflict feminism as the most prominent strand of feminism in a global plane. In contrast, and that's why for me the Mexico conference is very interesting and important, because in contrast to an earlier moment or an alternative moment of global feminism, I don't think this was the only way in which it could think. So that the way in which, and then the Mexico to Beijing sort of is a one sort of capsule version of that change. That in Mexico, the story that Irene Tinker and all these people say about Mexico is about the differences between different kinds of feminism, particularly global North and global South feminism, but the global South feminism that then had alliances with black feminism and with different kinds of critiques of sort of dominant white feminism. And then in Beijing, the story is often, and maybe not always, but often the story of Beijing is a story not of differences but of unity. That it feels like by Beijing, who are we fighting? We are fighting the Vatican, we are fighting Saudi Arabia, we are fighting, these are the enemies. It's not, the enemy is not within, and it's partly about tracing what's lost in that shift. But for me, international conflict feminism is about what's lost in that shift, what produces the unity in the story of Beijing, and what was so rich and possible about the story of Mexico. And for me, part of that is embedded in this larger story of, in the way in which in post-Cold War, the Security Council gets particularly empowered. It is a moment where in a global context, where the most powerful countries in the world get to shape things, and conflict becomes often the calling card for these things. So it's the war in the former Yugoslavia. It's Rwanda. It's all of these sort of that becomes the way in which human rights travels, feminism travels, and for instance, transitional justice becomes such a big thing, because within human rights, where earlier and larger, when you can, in each of these fields, you can see what's lost and what's gone. So in human rights, a larger vision about what the human rights agenda is gets narrowed in a very particular way, with transitional justice becoming the most dominant and sexy dimension of human rights in this particular moment. Or within feminism, CEDAW gets marginalized in a particular way, and you get, international, what I call international conflict feminism, as becoming the feminism of the moment in some sense. So there are various kinds of shifts that happen here on a global context. So that's one thing. So that's why conflict becomes a particular opportunity in some sense. And in Sri Lanka, of course, the tsunami story and the conflict story get deeply intertwined, very much like in Aceh and other places as well. The tsunami and the conflict they have different trajectories into what happened on the ground, but they become intertwined stories, because it was the conflict-affected areas that was most affected by the tsunami as well. And then, I think the resonances with other contexts is still right. I think maybe in one of the footnotes here, again, in like some random aside, I speak about how the language is so similar to how inner city gentrification is discussed in the U.S. about the ways in which how the security, if we don't act, this it's to the broken windows kind of language. But if we don't act, if we don't, things are going to go. It's going to be. It's going to go or become all. It's going to be just random insecurity. So the language of security has a particular resonance that's used. So that I think is a broader thing that's used quite a lot. And of course, it has colonial resonances. I mean, so one of these, when I describe how Sri Lanka emerges or shifts from becoming a zone, in pre-83 in particular, it was primarily, was part of various Orientalist and neo-colonial projects, but as in the development field. And then once the war started, it shifts from the development field to the conflict field. And one of the things you see from that is that it does speak of conflict as something that's apolitical, that just runs through, and that's a colonial resonance, right? So when Ranajit Guha speaks in Subaltern Studies about how peasant insurgencies are described and so on, he speaks about all the naturalistic metaphors that are used to describe how riots spread like wildfire and like what. So I think that's that kind of depoliticizing of a mode then that opens up the possibility for colonial intervention, say in the 19th century in India, has I think deep resonances here. So yeah, so I think the resonances are true both historically as well as currently in a whole different ways. But I think also the specifics matter to be able to understand how the work that conflict does in some sense, and even though it may be traveling on parallel structures in some sense.
So I don't know if you talked about this already, but I'm wondering about how we kind of deal with this debt issue, because debt, when I think about it, I don't subscribe to like the notions of like honor, like honoring your debt. And I'm like, okay, that's nice, but why? So when I think about debt, I think about it in a very legal sense. And international debt obviously has to do with international law. So you talked about this actually at the Internationalism Conference. You expressed your distaste for international legal institutions. So I'm wondering that, going back to like Haiti and the 1825 indemnity, and Puerto Rico and the debt crisis, and Sri Lanka, since international law is part and parcel of these debt crises and of how they allow for these neoliberal and neocolonial projects, and because even the better international institutions, like the ones that have slightly more scruples than the IMF and the World Bank, clearly aren't interested in seriously dealing with this. How do we deal with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably, I mean, I have, so this is not a prescription so much, but just in terms of how I think of it as in a highly schizophrenic way. So I think of it on the one hand as, like burn the system down, and on the other hand as reform the system and let's get some temporary relief. I think most of how I think about the questions of debt that. So I completely agree with you that to have either of those positions, one cannot have a naive faith in the promise of things like honor or those kinds of. I mean, that's part of what I'm forgetting now because my brain is a bit fried. But the author I quote, who teaches at Wesleyan, which is a political scientist, who uses this language of technomorality, which I think is a useful way of thinking about how particular kind of sort of moralistic claims of terms like honor get used and infused with sort of technical modalities or technologies of governance like debt, and get embedded into sort of economistic language about how the world works, and then it's a question of unraveling all of those and how they're related and unrelated. The continuities and discontinuities are embedded within those things. So I think one important critical thing is to sort of demystify notions like honor or notions like or the kinds of ways in which like Haiti gets and to expose, for instance, why is Haiti repaying a loan that is itself itself so odious. And so I think, but but I also think that you have to do that in both ways. You have to both say, burn the system, but you also have to do, so like the doctrine of odious debt is in fact a proposal for a legal doctrine to have a legal reason to then renege on loans that were made by past governments that were odious, right? So there's that were not representing their people. And so it may be a doctrine that has little purchase today by most lending agencies. So if you take the doctrine of odious debt to the IMF or the World Bank, they are not going to respect it. But there have been many efforts to do things like that, right? And I think, for instance, the new international economic order was a proposal to rethink some of the economies of sovereign debt and the background conditions of that in those particular ways. And there have been sort of many different efforts. So I think most have failed, and a few have been successful. And I think the effort is constantly to push against the system, and while one also, without having necessarily, I guess, faith, for lack of a better word, in its promises. In a sense, the argument is that we need to be as savvy in manipulating financial instruments, or we need to be as savvy in manipulating the law, and that there's enough indeterminacy in these things, and with that combined with the context, the possibilities of political struggle. I mean, we see all over the world today in many ways that things that seemed improbable have, presidents have resigned, and people have been, fare hikes have been reversed in Chile. I mean, there's been changes out there that were, just 1 month ago seemed inconceivable. So.
I thought we were going to end on odious debt. You had to have a high point. Well, should we thank you, and we can stay around and have smaller conversations?
Cool. Thank you.